Rudeness. This is a One School for All lecture by Andrea Thomas for Østfold University College. I want you to watch by Monday the 9th of October. So we're going to look at rudeness today, and we're going to look at three particular approaches to rudeness. They are addressed by, firstly, the testing literature and the knowledge about the pupil approach that we've already looked at. So I'm going to summarise that. But also this book by Scott, Two Cheers for Anarchism. But also we're going to mention slightly Foucault's very brief treatment of it in Abnormal. Foucault has much more interesting things to say about rudeness elsewhere, but I wanted to keep it to this chapter. He actually refers to it more in the chapter before the one I've given you, so you can look up that if you want to go into more detail. So those are three approaches, and essentially the background is the idea of the hidden transcript. Now, a hidden transcript is the idea that there is some kind of discourse going on, a discourse of resistance going on behind the public transcripts. So what people say in out of politeness and good form in public has got its own rules and grammar, but essentially there are bits of what they say there which have a great deal more significance and go in different directions if you look behind the scene. And one of those ways is rudeness. So the idea of rudeness is you break rules, public rules, in order to say something behind the scenes about what you really feel, which you aren't actually in a position to say usually, because of, like I say, acceptance, what is acceptable to say, and because people will lose face if you say it. So that's the idea of hidden transcript. We'll come back to it when we talk about Scott. But first of all, I wanted to talk about the testing approach. The idea, so my question is, what would you do if you're in a classroom and one of your pupils farts an awful lot? Now, there are a lot of things you could have to do, and a lot of decisions you have to make. You have to decide whether the pupil is doing it deliberately or not. And of course, if they're not doing it deliberately, then it's just unfortunate. And essentially, what you want to do is some kind of medical screening. And that's all you have to do. Of course, it could be non-deliberate in another way, or in the sense of that it could be some kind of compulsive behaviour, that the pupil feels obliged to fart in the presence of some kind of authority. But again, that's not really your issue. That's a kind of issue with authority that they need help with. They can't react to authority in that way, or it's unfortunate for them if they react to that issue to authorities like that in the future when they're applying for jobs, for example. So essentially, that is not your issue again, and you can send the pupil on for treatment of particular social issues. Now, that's what's the case if you look on the pupil on their own. What is if you're just looking at the particular form of expression that the pupil has chosen in this particular situation. But what about if you choose it in this direction? i.e., what about if this is an issue between you and the pupil? What if it's a form of communication? And I don't mean in the sense that some people can burp the entire alphabet. I mean, what if the fart is meant for you and not just a symptom of the pupil's solitary behaviour? And that's Scott's approach. Scott says that a lot of rudeness is actually some kind of communication to some kind of totalitarian leadership. Somebody that can't express themselves in any other way will use rudeness to express their objection to what is going on. And Scott particularly talks about this as a form of peasant resistance. So he sees this very much in rural situations. He talks about it as a kind of way of, as a mode of insubordination. It's a way of throwing a spanner in the works of the system. You refuse to follow rules and to recognise the demands of inclusion. If you ignore the cameras, if you and if we as people who are on the other side of that, and actually not using this but observing this behaviour, ignore the way this might be categorised as punishment deserving behaviour, the way that it's actually breaking rules, or it's actually excluding themselves and resisting these forms of exclusion that we've been examining in the past. Maybe behind the scenes, behind all of these issues, there might be a hidden message going on, and that's Scott's idea, that he tries to discern the hidden forms of communication which are taking place in rudeness. Now, that's Scott's idea. It's basically a form of peasant resistance. Now, Foucault's take on it is slightly more cynical. Basically, Foucault says that yes, the insubordination might be used in agrarian situations to make the leader lose face, so that they can't use their power quite so much because nobody respects them anymore. But in our societies, in our bureaucratic societies, sovereignty works. Oh, that's nice. Sovereignty works as such. Without the need for somebody actually having to be respected. You don't have to think of somebody as a great person in order for their power to be real. Just think of George Bush, for example. People laughed at him as much as they liked, but he was still the president. So essentially Foucault's idea about this is that, well, yeah, maybe burping or farting is a form of insubordination, but it's not an effective one, is it? Essentially, at the end of the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, the Emperor can say, well, yes, I am naked, but I'm still the bloody Emperor. And that's Foucault's take on insubordination and peasant resistance. So essentially we've looked at three approaches to rudeness. You can address it as something that you can have knowledge about, and then the pupil is on their own. This is just what does this tell me about that pupil? Or you can look at it as communication. And if it's communication, then you can try and find out what they're trying to say with Scott, or you can find out why they are so powerless with Foucault. I have, of course, omitted to mention the obvious reaction to rudeness, which is, of course, replying in kind, being rude back to the pupil. Treating pupils as opponents, as opposed to people that he's sharing space with, is perhaps the most tempting and the most common approach to rudeness. It is perhaps also the most objectionable.